His Excellency David Comissiong to deliver his lecture.
Thank you, Charles. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I bring you greetings from the sunny Caribbean island of Barbados, home of such outstanding global citizens as Sir Garfield Sobers, Rihanna, Eddie Grant, and Prime Minister Mia Amor Motley. Permit me to begin by saying how honored and humbled I am to be entrusted with this 5th Nelson Mandela Lecture, and I would like to sincerely thank the Nelson Mandela Day Australia Inc. and Dr. Rametse and Dr. Charles Mfande. Thank you so much for extending this honor to me. I would like to dedicate this lecture to the memory of the late Zinzi Mandela, who spoke so eloquently for her father back in February 1985, when the whole world was waiting for a message from the then imprisoned Mandela. As Dr. Rametse said, she became the voice of the imprisoned Nelson Mandela. May her soul rest in peace. Now, as many of you may be aware, the people of Barbados and Australia know each other quite well through the game of cricket. But we also share another bond that is based on our respective contributions to the ending of apartheid in South Africa, the campaign to free Nelson Mandela, and our efforts to honor and preserve the legacy of Nelson Mandela. Barbados actually has quite a proud record of anti-apartheid activism. It goes way back to 1951, when a black Barbadian seaman by the name of Milton King visited South Africa and was literally beaten to death by 2 white racist police officers. When the news reached Barbados, the then colonial era but still black dominated House of Assembly attempted to pass a bill totally banning trade between Barbados and South Africa. Unfortunately, as a result of the influence of white businessmen and conservatives, the bill was frustrated. But in 1960, after the Sharpeville massacre, Barbados was able to institute a total ban on trade between our island and South Africa. So fast forward to 1976. Barbados permitted Cuban troops, the Cuban planes that were carrying soldiers to Angola. The planes landed in Barbados, refueled in Barbados in order to make that journey across the Atlantic to Angola. And we know that in 1987, those Cuban troops, along with Angolan troops, were able to rout and defeat the white South African army at the famous Battle of Quito Carnavale, thereby paving a way for the eventual fall of apartheid. Also, 1986, one of the greatest daughters of Barbados, Dame Nita Barrow, a member of the Commonwealth Group of Eminent Persons, visits Nelson Mandela in prison and helps to put in place a process to negotiate the end of apartheid in South Africa. And then that great day in February 1990, when Nelson Mandela walks out of the Victor Verster prison arm in arm with Winnie Mandela, the people of Barbados celebrated with a mass rally, 15,000 or more people celebrating that great victory. And at that rally, the crowd passed by acclamation a decision that a Mandela Freedom Park would be erected in Barbados. It took some time, but in 2017, a beautiful Mandela Freedom Park was established at the university campus here in Barbados, and in fact it was officially opened by Nelson's granddaughter, Ndileka Mandela. So that's just a little bit of background about Barbados's record in honoring Nelson Mandela and participating to the struggle of the black people of South Africa. Now, for our topic, reparations and the Nelson Mandela mission of transforming and humanizing structures of oppression. As you would have heard, I am Barbados's ambassador to the Caribbean community, CARICOM, we call it. CARICOM is a multi-nation association. It comprises 14 independent countries of the Caribbean, one non-independent country, 15 full members, and we also have 5 non-independent Caribbean countries that are associate members of CARICOM. The population of CARICOM is predominantly of African descent. In Barbados, for example, 90% of our population is descended from enslaved Africans who were transported across the Atlantic Oceans to work on the sugar plantations of the Caribbean. So let us have a quick look at some of the fundamental features of the history of the Caribbean community as it pertains to the issue of reparations. And I'll take you through this quite quickly. In 1834, after 225 years of relentless rebellion by our enslaved ancestors, slavery was abolished throughout the British Empire. And the methodology devised by the British government for the abolition of slavery was to calculate the capital or labor value of the then existing population of enslaved Africans in the Caribbean, supposedly owned by the British slave masters, and to compensate not our enslaved ancestors, but to compensate the slave masters for their supposed loss of property. The value of that generation of enslaved Africans was calculated by the British government at £47 million. £47 million in 1834. And that £47 million was paid out as follows. £20 million in a cash payment to the slave masters, and £27 million in quote-unquote free labor that our supposedly freed ancestors were obliged to give to the slave masters for another 6 years, a period known as apprenticeship. Now, the important thing to note is that 1834 payment of £47 million is the equivalent of 178.6 billion pounds in today's money values. 178 billion pounds. Indeed, back in 1834, the sum of money was so large, some 40% of the annual budget of the British government, that the British government actually borrowed money and issued government bonds in order to pay that compensation to the slave masters. And would you believe that the last payments that the British government made on those slave master compensation bonds, the last payments the British Treasury made on those bonds were made in the year 2015, a mere 5 years ago. So we can dismiss their argument that reparations is about something in the distant past. The other thing to note is this: that valuation of 178 billion pounds in today's values was for one generation of enslaved Africans. But there was not only one generation of enslaved Africans in the Caribbean. In fact, there were multiple generations of enslaved Africans who were worked to death on the plantations of the Caribbean. Furthermore, that 178 billion pounds had nothing to do with the 2 centuries of whippings, mutilations, castrations, burning to death, beheadings, starvings, rapes, branding with hot irons, hangings, breaking at the wheel, or with the horrors of the Middle Passage. You know, I often tell audiences that the concentration camp did not begin in Nazi Germany of the 1930s. The concentration camp began with the British in 17th century Caribbean in places like slave colonies, British slave colonies like Barbados and Jamaica. The slave plantation of the 17th century was actually the world's first concentration camps. The other thing to note is that that 178 billion pound valuation had nothing to do with the damage that was done to the African continent itself. The destruction of towns, villages, and kingdoms in Africa, the mass kidnappings, the displacement of millions of people, the plague of European diseases, the decimation of the African people, the depopulation of Africa, the disruption of Africa's historical developmental process. Nor did that 178 billion pounds have anything to do with the unjust enrichment from which Britain and Europe profited. The development of Europe's massively wealthy industrial civilization at the expense of the underdevelopment of Africa and of the sons and daughters of Africa in the Caribbean and the Americas. When you look at European development, the development of European shipping, shipbuilding, manufacturing industry, agro-processing industry, the infrastructural development in the form of harbors, docks, canals, heavy engineering works, major cities, the development of banking and insurance, all of this based on the system of slave production in places like the Caribbean and the Americas, and the system of trade that went with that slavery-based production. And so it is against that historical background that in July of 2013, the 15 heads of government of the Caribbean community made an historic decision to launch a reparations claim against the governments of several European states. And that claim is for two things. One, it is for the genocide perpetrated against the 15 million indigenous or aboriginal people that the Europeans found in the Caribbean when they first came to this region, and they perpetrated genocide against those indigenous or aboriginal people. So we understand the cause of the aboriginal people of Australia. It is also for that reparations claim, is also for the multiplicity of crimes against humanity that were committed against the enslaved black or African people of the Caribbean over multiple generations. And let me say that the countries that we have targeted thus far are Spain, Britain, France, Portugal, the Netherlands, Denmark, Norway, and Sweden. Now, having made that decision, the Caribbean heads of government commenced putting a structure in place to carry forward that reparations campaign. And I'll just give you the bare bones of the structure. First, we started with the establishment of National Reparations Committee. Every CARICOM member state established at a governmental level a National Reparations Committee to carry forward the reparations struggle at a national level. And then the chairperson of each of those national committees, the chairpersons were brought together in a region-wide CARICOM Reparations Commission. And that region-wide commission has been given the responsibility to conceptualize and prosecute the reparations campaign. And then they established, to help that CARICOM Reparations Commission, we established a CARICOM Reparations Research Institute. And that institute is located at the Jamaica campus of our University of the West Indies. And then on top of all of those entities, we have a 6-member Prime Ministerial Subcommittee on Reparations. That Prime Ministerial Subcommittee is chaired by the Prime Minister of Barbados, and it is that committee that gives policy guidance and direction to the CARICOM Reparations Commission. And incidentally, the CARICOM Reparations Commission is chaired by a very outstanding Barbadian and Pan-Africanist scholar, Sir Hilary Beckles, the Vice Chancellor of the University of the West Indies. And so we have been pressing ahead with our reparations claim over the past 7 years. The CARICOM Reparations Commission has established a CARICOM Reparations 10-point plan. And I'll go through that plan. I just give you the headings very quickly. The things that we are demanding from the European countries. First, a formal apology from the governments of the relevant European nations. Secondly, a voluntary repatriation program for all of those Caribbean diasporans who wish to physically return to the continent of Africa. Number 3, an indigenous people development program, because in spite of the genocide, we still have members of the indigenous community in the Caribbean. So we are saying to the European countries, you must finance a specific development program for the indigenous people of the Caribbean. Number 4, a program to establish relevant and needed cultural institutions in the Caribbean. Number 5, a program to deal with the Caribbean's public health crisis. We have a crisis of diabetes, high blood pressure, non-communicable diseases that go right back to those centuries of enslavement. Number 6, an enhanced education development program for the Caribbean. Number 7, an African knowledge program for people of the Caribbean component of the African diaspora. Number 8, a systematic effort at psychological rehabilitation and healing from the traumas of the centuries of genocide and enslavement. 9, a technology transfer program. 10, a process of debt cancellation of the national debts of the CARICOM member states. So that was the initial 10-point plan. Subsequently, our commission added 3 additional demands. 1, the establishment of a Caribbean Sustainability Fund to be financed by the relevant European governments. 2, the removal from places of public celebration of all monuments and statues of historical personalities that were implicated in the crime of enslavement. And finally, that October the 12th, the day on which Christopher Columbus landed in the Caribbean in 1492 and commenced the African Holocaust, that day be designated Caribbean Holocaust Day. So, brothers and sisters, I would ask you to take careful note of the fact that for us in the Caribbean, reparations is not simply about a money payment. Yes, there is a money component, but reparations is about much, much more than a mere money payment. We conceive of reparations as a revolutionary program of transformation that is designed to eradicate structures, practices, and consequences of anti-Black and anti-Indigenous or Aboriginal racism, discrimination, and inequality, and to create just societies. Indeed, we conceive of our campaign for reparations as perhaps the most critical phase in our mass-based mission to humanize the locations of barbarism that our ancestors were deposited in by the commercial and political elite of Britain and Europe back in the 17th century. Our societies began as evil, barbaric slave societies, and it is the masses of our people, the Black people, formerly enslaved, the enslaved and then formerly enslaved, who have humanized these locations of barbarism by a superhuman effort of will. But we recognize that as much as we have done, there is still much more to be done. So reparations is perhaps the latest phase in that mass campaign to humanize these societies, these former locations of barbarism. So you can see from the program that I have outlined that we are sending a message to the European countries. And it is a simple message. This is our message. We are saying to Europe, you cannot commit a crime. Profit from that crime. Cause immense damage to a people as a result of that crime, and simply walk away from the scene of your crime with your ill-gotten gain. No, we are inviting you to return to the scene of the crime, to engage in a developmental conversation with the people you have injured, and to find a way to make a developmental contribution to those societies and people that you injured, those societies and people that you plundered and that you unjustly profited from. We are inviting you to do what is necessary in order to come to some just and reasonable reconciliation. That's the message we are sending. But you know, there's another dimension to it. This demand for reparations also has an international dimension. There is an international dimension to our reparations campaign that goes way beyond the Caribbean and that has implications for the entire international order. As we have engaged in this reparations journey, we began thinking, just about the Caribbean. But as we have engaged in this journey, it has become increasingly clear to us that our campaign for reparations or for reparatory justice must be a campaign that is also designed to produce the just society, not only in the Caribbean, but internationally as well. Thus, we have also started to formulate a demand for a fundamental transformation of the inequitable and exploitative economic and power relations that are still to be found currently existing in the international order. An international order that has its roots in those centuries of slavery and colonialism. And so take note, this international dimension of reparations has implications for the restructuring of such important international institutions as the United Nations Security Council, the World Bank, the IMF, institutions that were established when the black nations of this world were still colonies, and that therefore do not sufficiently contain our presence or our influence within their structures. The international dimension of reparations also has implications for the terms of international trade and finance. For example, it envisages reforming the inequitable and insensitive manner in which many of the international financial institutions treat the small developing nations of the Caribbean, and the manner in which multilateral organizations like the European Union callously and unjustly blacklist, and that's a very notable word, blacklist and punish Caribbean nations for daring to develop international business industries. It has implications for how the vulnerable small island developing states of the Caribbean, states that were plundered by European nations for centuries, how we are now to be treated in both the climate change crisis and in the crisis brought on by the COVID-19 pandemic. We are only now beginning to flesh out this internationalist dimension of our reparations campaign. But in the months and years ahead, you will witness the CARICOM Reparatory Justice Campaign striving for a worldwide transformation of centuries-old relationships between the peoples of the world. Relationships that tragically are still based on old but persisting patterns of discrimination, exploitation, inequity, and domination. Relationships that are rooted in centuries of imperialism, colonialism, systemic racial discrimination, enslavement, and native genocide. Indeed, you can expect to see the CARICOM Reparatory Justice Campaign promoting and striving for the sort of global justice that the world so desperately needs now. Reparatory justice in all of its dimensions: climate justice, economic justice, social justice, as we strive for the new relationships that will shift the current destructive economic model towards social, economic, and environmental sustainability. This, my friends, must be seen as being part and parcel of a process of transforming and humanizing an international order that has its roots in the centuries-long system of institutionalized anti-Black racism that resonated so deeply in the Caribbean. So, stay tuned for what is on its way. Or, better yet, get on board the reparations train, a train that promises to take us into a brighter and a more humane and sustainable future. The reparations campaign is not only for the Caribbean, it is for all of us. It is for the entire global community. But some of you might be asking, what does any of this have to do with Nelson Mandela? Let me answer that question now. As I see Nelson Mandela, Nelson Mandela's entire career can best be conceived as a striving for reparative justice, as a lifelong mission to transform and humanize structures of oppression, namely the structures of oppression that were built into one of the world's most evil and brutal systems of institutionalized anti-Black racism, the South African apartheid system. But before we go any further, let me deal preemptively with a particularly troublesome aspect of the Mandela legacy. Let me say from the outset that I do not accept the artificial bifurcation that so many scholars have sought to impose upon the life and career of Nelson Mandela. Namely, this idea of a pre-1990 Mandela as a warrior and a man of violence, and the post-1990 Saint Nelson Mandela as a turn-the-other-cheek man of compassion and forgiveness. I don't accept that. There was only one Nelson Mandela. Nelson Mandela was always a man of deep humanity and compassion. He was always committed to the notion that there is a brotherhood of all human beings and that all human beings are entitled to a common birthright of freedom and dignity. He always nurtured a non-racial vision for his beloved South Africa. Indeed, from the earliest days of his civil rights activism, Mandela was always searching for racial reconciliation, was always evincing a spirit of goodwill towards the white population of South Africa, and was always advocating dialogue. Permit me to prove this by taking a quick look at Mandela's career of activism. Let's start with the year 1944. 1944, the year in which Mandela and other young activists founded the ANC Youth League. Mandela started as General Secretary and became President of the Youth League. Between 1944 and May 1961, the date of the national stay-at-home strike that was violently repressed by the apartheid government, Mandela utilized non-violent civil disobedience as his preferred strategy for confronting unjust and dehumanizing apartheid laws and institutions. The purpose of that non-violent civil disobedience was to defy and discomfit the governmental authorities, to force them to engage with the African activists and to commence a process of dialogue and negotiation, a process aimed at transforming oppressive, racist apartheid structures, opening them up and getting them to acknowledge and include African humanity, getting them to recognize and include the legitimate rights of the African people, thereby creating the humane, non-racist social order that delivers freedom and dignity to all South Africans. Evidence of the strategy of non-violent civil disobedience is to be found in the Defiance Campaign, which started in 1949 with Mandela serving as volunteer-in-chief, and in the more grassroots M-Plan, named after Mandela, which commenced in the mid-1950s. They engaged in demonstrations, mass refusals to obey unjust laws, stay-at-home maneuvers, and economic boycotts. And when Mandela addressed the court during the famous treason trial, he explained the rationale behind this strategy as follows. Let me quote the actual words of Nelson Mandela. He said, "We demand universal adult franchise, and we are prepared to exert economic pressure to attain our demands, and we will launch defiance campaigns, stay-at-homes, either singly or together, until the government should say, 'Gentlemen, we cannot have this state of affairs, laws being defied, and this whole situation created by stay-at-homes. Let's talk.' In my view, I would say, yes, let us talk." The words of Nelson Mandela. That was nonviolent civil disobedience. However, by mid-1961, with the apartheid government having banned the ANC and declared it an illegal organization, and with the apartheid government having instituted a severe violent crackdown on the African civil rights movement, as evidenced by the 1960 Sharpeville massacre, Mandela and the ANC abandoned the strategy of non-violent civil disobedience and established an armed wing, Umkhonto we Sizwe, with Mandela as its commander. And so the methodology changed from non-violent civil disobedience to armed struggle. But what is important to note is that the objective remained the same. The objective still remained to transform and humanize the oppressive apartheid structures, to create the inclusive, non-racist community for all South Africans of all races, to bring about racial reconciliation. And I want to go to Mandela's words again. Let's listen to how Mandela explained this new strategy of armed struggle at the equally famous 1963 Rivonia trial. These are his words. "We chose to defy the law. We first broke the law in a way which avoided any recourse to violence. When this form was legislated against, and when the government resorted to a show of force to crush opposition to its policies, only then did we decide to answer violence with violence. But the violence we chose to adopt was not terrorism. Of the 4 forms of violence Mandela said was open to them, he said the 4 forms were sabotage, guerrilla warfare, terrorism, and open revolution. He said that they chose sabotage. And again, these are Mandela's words. It did not involve loss of life, and it offered the best hope for future race relations. Bitterness would be kept to a minimum, and if the policy bore fruit, democratic government could become a reality." End of quote. And we all know the famous peroration that Nelson Mandela enunciated as he concluded his speech at the Rivonia trial. And I'll repeat it. This is what he said: "During my lifetime, I have dedicated myself to this struggle of the African people. I have fought against white domination, and I have fought against black domination. I have cherished the ideal of a democratic and free society in which all persons live together in harmony and with equal opportunities. It is an ideal which I hope to live for and to achieve. But if needs be, it is an ideal for which I am prepared to die." End of quote. Well, we know the rest of the story. Fortunately, he did not die. He was not given the death sentence, as was feared. Instead, he was sentenced to life in prison, and after having spent 27 years in prison, the apartheid authorities, faced with increasing rebellion from the African people and with increasing economic boycott internationally, came to the conclusion that they had no choice but to free Nelson Mandela in 1990. And between Mandela's release from prison in 1990 and his winning of the presidency in 1994, he engaged with the then President F.W. de Klerk in negotiating away the formal, official, legal structures of apartheid, opening up and transforming political structures of oppression, opening them up to include African humanity, inclusive of the attainment of universal adult suffrage. And then, after assuming the presidency in 1994, Mandela dedicated his presidency to a process of racial and national reconciliation, with the centerpiece of that process being the establishment of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission to investigate crimes committed under apartheid, to grant individual amnesties in exchange for testimony of crimes committed, and very importantly, to propose and implement methodologies for bringing about reconciliation between the two major racial groups of the country. Now, as far as I am concerned, the spirit, the objective, the methodology of Nelson Mandela's activism during his non-violent civil disobedience phase, during his armed struggle phase, during his presidential phase, is characterized by a search for reparative justice. It is all about transforming and humanizing structures of oppression and seeking racial reconciliation within a new relationship of equality. And this, for me, is the very essence of the campaign for reparations, the campaign for reparative justice that our nations of the Caribbean community have embarked upon since 2013. Now, it is important to note that Nelson Mandela assumed the presidency in 1994 at the age of 76 years. He founded the Truth and Reconciliation Commission under the chairmanship of Archbishop Desmond Tutu 1 year later, in 1995, and had it up and running in 1996, the second year of his presidency. However, Nelson Mandela only served one term as president and demitted office in 1999, long before the Truth and Reconciliation Commission had completed its work. So, ladies and gentlemen, I want to move now rapidly to our conclusion and to tie all the strands of our discourse together. First of all, how did the reparatory justice process that Nelson Mandela put in motion during his presidency end? How did it end? What were its results? And does that story have any lessons for the Caribbean community and our own reparatory justice campaign? Well, Mandela demitted office in 1999, some 4 years before the Truth and Justice Commission concluded its work and delivered its final report. It delivered its final report in 2003 during the presidency of Thabo Mbeki. The Canadian journalist Naomi Klein has told the story in her highly acclaimed book titled The Shock Doctrine. And I'm just going to read a small passage from that book. This is what Naomi Klein said about this. She said, "After hearing years of testimony about tortures, killings, and disappearances, the Truth and Justice Commission turned to the questions of what kind of gestures would begin to heal the injustices. Truth and forgiveness were important, but so was compensation for the victims and their families. In the end, the Truth and Justice Commission made the modest recommendation of a one-time 1% corporate tax to raise money for the victims, what it called a solidarity tax. The government, then headed by Mbeki, rejected any suggestion of corporate reparations or of a solidarity tax, fearing that it would send an anti-business message to the market. The president decided not to hold business accountable. In the end, the government put forward a fraction of what had been requested, taking the money out of its own budget. End of quote. So, the ANC government turned its back on the fundamental reparatory justice principle that had been at the heart of ANC policy from its founding in 1912. That was the overarching theme of the 1955 Freedom Charter of the South African People's Movement, and that had been the central philosophy of Nelson Mandela throughout his entire life. Of course, by 2003, the ANC had become so wedded to Washington consensus neoliberal free market policies that there was no place in its thinking for reparative justice measures based on redistribution of ill-gotten wealth. We must remember that during that critical 1990 to 1994 period, when Nelson Mandela was engaged in high-level negotiations with F.W. de Klerk over reforming the political governance structures of the country, Thabo Mbeki was likewise leading similar negotiations with the apartheid regime in relation to the economic structures and policies. The end result of South Africa's failure to properly and fully carry through the ANC's and Mandela's reparatory justice idea is that today, South Africa remains one of the most racially unjust societies in the world, with the bulk of the country's resources still remaining in the hands of a white minority and with unconscionable levels of black poverty and dispossession. So, the South Africa story is a cautionary tale for the Caribbean community. It tells us that it is not enough to simply have good intentions. It is not enough to simply have the idea of a reparatory justice campaign or even to set it in motion. That is not enough. Rather, what is required is a determination to pitch our demands for reparatory reforms at a level where, if and when they are implemented, they will achieve a fundamental and decisive breakthrough in the structure of black poverty and inequality. And to have the determination not to compromise on our people's sacred and historic claim to justice, but to see it through to its full and glorious culmination. But there is also a lesson for the current governmental administration of South Africa. The administration of President Ramaphosa can learn from the Caribbean community that it is never too late for reparatory justice. It is never too late to say to your historical exploiters, you cannot commit a crime, profit from that crime, cause immense damage to a people as a result of that crime, and simply walk away from the scene of your crime with your ill-gotten gain. The truth is that the black people of the Caribbean should have received reparations as long ago as 1834, when slavery was abolished. As long ago as 1834, when they compensated the slave masters with the equivalent of 178 billion pounds. The black people of the Caribbean should have received reparations in 1958, when Britain established a West Indies Federation. We should have received reparations in the 1960s and 70s, when our countries gained their independence from Britain. There were multiple occasions in the past when the Caribbean people should have been paid reparations and were not. Just as there are past occasions when the black people of South Africa should have received reparatory justice but did not. But the good news is that it is never too late for justice. It is never too late to do the right thing. Reparations is an idea whose time has come. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.